She said it in front of everyone. That is the part that stayed with me longest. Not the word itself, though the word was its own wound, but the ease of it, the lightness, the way it came out of her mouth as though it were nothing more than an observation about the weather, a simple fact, a thing that simply was. We were at Daniel and Priya's house for Sunday lunch. My son's house. They had invited the family. Me and Joe, Marjorie and her husband, the children running between the rooms. And I had done what I always did, what I had always done, what I had been doing for 30 years without anyone once suggesting there was a better way. I had cooked, not for the whole lunch. Priya cooked too, but I had brought my dish, the one I always brought to Sunday lunches, the one that had been my mother's and before her my grandmother's. The lamb braised with the root vegetables and the particular combination of herbs that I had adjusted over 3 decades until it was exactly as it should be. The recipe is not written down anywhere except in my hands and my memory. Nobody else in the world makes it quite the way I make it. I carried it in from the kitchen. I set it on the table. The smell of it reached the room before I did. That particular smell, the slow-cooked warmth of it, the herbs, the wine in the sauce. And for a moment the room responded the way rooms always responded to that smell. Faces turned. Nostrils lifted slightly. Someone, I think it was Marjorie's husband, said, "Well, that smells wonderful." And Priya looked at the dish. And then she looked at Daniel. And she said, pleasantly, with the lightness of someone who thinks they are making a reasonable observation, "It's very old-fashioned, isn't it?" And she turned back to her own dish. Something bright and composed and arranged on the plate in a modern way, with leaves and seeds and a dressing drizzled in a pattern. And the table moved on. Someone passed the serving spoon. The children were called in from the other room. The conversation resumed, and I sat down, and I helped myself to my own dish because no one else was quite sure how much to take. And I ate it quietly, and the lamb was exactly right. 30 years of exactly right. And nobody said so. I want to tell you about those 30 years. I want to tell you what they contained. And I want to tell you what happened. Eventually, that changed the way Priya looked at the dish I carried in from the kitchen. Not all at once. Not with a single moment of dramatic revelation. But genuinely and completely. The way things change when they change from the inside. Oh, my name is Constance. Most people call me Connie, and I allow it, though my mother always said my full name and I have always felt its full weight was right. Constance. Steadfast. The word behind the name. I have tried to live up to it. I am 67 years old. I have been cooking seriously since I was 9 years old, which means I have been at it for 58 years. Not counting the years I helped my mother before that. The years of standing on a stool at the kitchen counter, watching her hands, learning the language before I could speak it myself. If you count those years, which I think you should, I have been in a kitchen with intention for as long as I have been a conscious person. My mother was an extraordinary cook. I say this not as a daughter's sentimentality, but as a genuine culinary assessment. She cooked with the completeness of someone who understood that food is not only fuel and not only pleasure, but is also history. The accumulated knowledge of everyone who cooked before you, passed forward through the hands and the senses rather than through words. She cooked the way musicians play, with both technical mastery and something beyond it, something that comes from the place where skill meets love and produces something neither can produce alone. She had a recipe book, handwritten, in the careful copper plate of someone taught to write when writing was considered a craft in itself. Not all the recipes were hers. Many came from her own mother, who had come from a place where food was survival and therefore every meal was approached with the seriousness of something that mattered. The book was falling apart by the time I inherited it. I repaired it with tape and kept it in the kitchen drawer, and I have used it, not to follow it, but to be in conversation with it, for 40 years. When I married Joe, I brought the recipe book to our first home. Joe is a man who understands that some things are more important than they appear to be. He has never once, in 45 years, complained about a meal I put in front of him. Not because he was passive. Joe is not a passive man, but because he is the specific kind of person who understands that complaining about someone's cooking is a form of complaining about their love. And he has never wanted to do that. He is also, I should say, someone who genuinely appreciates good food. He would come into the kitchen when I was cooking and say, "What are you making?" And I would tell him, and he would say, "Good. I'll be hungry." And he would be. And he was always right to be. Daniel came first. Then Marjorie 2 years later. They grew up at a table where dinner was a serious matter and lunch on Sundays was the most serious matter of the week. Not solemn. Serious in the way of something that is given full attention and full care. Joe and I believed that feeding your family well was one of the most direct expressions of love available to a human being. Not the only one, but a real one. A daily one. The one you could be depended upon for. Meal after meal. Year after year. Until the accumulation of all those meals became something that your children would carry in their bodies and their memories long after they had left your table. I cooked for 30 years. I cooked through Daniel's childhood and Marjorie's childhood, and through the years when they were teenagers who brought friends home, and through the years when the friends became people they married and brought home again. I cooked when money was tight and we needed the cheapest cuts that were also somehow the most flavorful. I cooked when money was better and I could afford the good butter and the proper wine for the sauce. I cooked when Joe was ill. A bad winter. 1 year. When his chest was terrible and the only thing that seemed to reach him was the chicken broth I made with the bones I'd been collecting in the freezer for a month. I cooked when the children left and the table shrank, and it would have been easier to eat sandwiches, but we did not, because the table was the table and it deserved the same attention at 2 as it had at 4. I cooked for 30 years and I cooked well, and I knew that I cooked well because I had been taught by someone who cooked well, and because I had practiced with the dedication of someone for whom this was not a chore but a craft. Not once, in 30 years, did anyone tell me that what I made was old-fashioned. Until Priya. Now, I want to be fair to Priya from the beginning. Because fairness matters and because this story does not work if she is simply a villain. She is not a villain. She is a woman with a history that shaped her, and the history made her what she is. And what she is includes some things that are genuinely admirable and some things that caused real pain. She is complicated, the way people are complicated. And by the end of this story, I understood her. Not completely, but enough. Daniel met Priya when he was 36. She was 33. She had grown up with food as a difficult subject, not in the way of poverty, but in the way of a family that was preoccupied with what food meant for health and weight and appearance, where eating was less about nourishment than about control. She had carried this complicated relationship with food into her 20s, and then, at 28, she had had a health scare. Something digestive, something that required a change. And she had found, in the process of changing, a food philosophy that gave her back a relationship with eating that was not about deprivation but about something she calls clean living. Whole foods. Plan forward. Nothing processed. No refined sugar. No heavy sauces. No slow-cooked rich things that sat in your stomach and reminded you of difficulty. She had made this philosophy her own, her identity, in a way, and she was not wrong to have done it. It had given her health and clarity and a sense of control over something that had once been very far out of control. I respect that. I understand it, now that I understand her history. But she had also, in the way of converts, become certain. She had decided that the clean way was the right way and that other ways were not simply different but inferior. Old-fashioned, heavy, out of date, food of people who did not yet know better. And when she looked at my lamb braise on that Sunday table, she saw all of it. The butter and the sauce, the slow cooking, the richness. And she said what she thought with the ease of someone who had forgotten to consider that what she was assessing was not just a dish but a person. A person's 30 years. A person's mother's hands. A person's grandmother's survival. She forgot all of that, because to Priya, it was just food. I want to tell you why it was not just food, why it was never just food, why it has never, in all of human history, been just food. Let me tell you what 30 years of cooking contains. It contains, first, knowledge. Not the kind you read in a book or watch on a screen, though those have their place. The kind that lives in the body. The knowledge of how hot is hot enough without being too hot. The knowledge of when a sauce has reduced to exactly the right consistency. Not by measuring, but by looking. By the way it coats the spoon. By the sound it makes in the pan. The knowledge of when bread dough is ready. Not by the clock, but by the feel of it under your hands. The particular elasticity that tells you the gluten has developed properly. This knowledge cannot be learned quickly. It can only be accumulated, year on year, meal on meal, mistake corrected and lesson absorbed, until the hands know things the mind did not teach them. It contains, second, memory. Every dish I make carries someone with it. The lamb braise carries my mother. Specifically, the Saturday morning when she taught it to me, when I was perhaps 25 and newly married, and she came to our first flat and we cooked together all morning, and she told me, as she told me many things, through the showing rather than the saying. She showed me the cut of the lamb and why. She showed me the vegetables and in what order. She showed me the herbs and how much of each and why the balance mattered. She showed me the wine, how much and what kind and at what point to add it and what it did to the sauce. And when it was done she tasted it and she nodded and she said, "Good. Now you can make it." And I've been making it ever since. The lamb braise carries her. Every time. When I lift the lid and the steam comes up and the smell fills the kitchen, she is there. Not painfully. Not with grief. Though she has been gone for 8 years and the grief is still real and still present. But with the warmth of someone who has passed something forward and continues to exist in the passing forward. That is what recipes do. That is what food does. It keeps the people who made it alive in the making. It contains, third, love. This is the thing that is hardest to explain to someone who has decided that food is primarily about nutrition. Love is not a macro. You cannot put it on a label. You cannot measure it in calories or grams of saturated fat. But it is in the food, and the people who eat it can feel it, and I have always believed that this is not sentiment but fact. The fact of attention, the fact of care, the fact of someone deciding that your nourishment mattered enough to spend time on, real time, the hours that slow cooking requires. When I make the lamb braise, I am in the kitchen for the better part of a day, not continuously. You cannot rush a braise. You can only tend it, check on it, adjust it, but present, available, giving the dish the time it requires because the people who will eat it deserve the time it requires. That is love. Expressed through food. The oldest human expression of love there is. The Priya called it old-fashioned. And what she meant, I understand now, was that it was old. That it came from an older way of thinking about food and time and bodies and what nourishment means. She was not entirely wrong about this. It is old. The recipe came from my grandmother, who learned it from her mother, who learned it from hers, in a chain of passing forward that stretches back further than I can trace. Old is the right word, but old-fashioned suggests that old means obsolete, that old means superseded, that old means the world has moved beyond it, found something better, and left it behind. And that is where Priya and I disagreed. That is where the word landed in me with the way it landed with. The world has not moved beyond love. The world has not found something that does what a slow-cooked dish does. What it does for the body and the memory and the sense of being cared for and the particular warmth of a meal that someone began making before you were hungry because they knew you would be hungry eventually and they wanted to have something ready. The world has not superseded that. It has tried, sometimes, with the quick and the process and the optimize and the clean, but it has not superseded the thing itself. Oh, I said none of this at the table. I ate my lamb quietly, and I smiled when the conversation reached me, and I helped Daisha cut her food into pieces small enough for a 7-year-old, and I went home with Joe in the car, and I said nothing to him about it either. Joe said, on the drive home, "Your lamb was wonderful," I said. "Thank you," he said. "The best you've made in a while." I thought. I said. "The herbs were right this time," he said. "They always are." We drove the rest of the way in comfortable silence. And at home I put the kettle on, and I sat at my kitchen table. My kitchen, with my mother's recipe book in the drawer and my grandmother's heavy pot on the shelf. And I thought about the word, old-fashioned. And I decided not to say anything, because the damage was done and saying something would not undo it, because I did not want to put Daniel in the middle of something uncomfortable, because I had too much pride to ask someone to value what I made. If they could not see the value, my telling them would not make them see it. But something had changed. Something that I did not fully notice until I noticed the consequences of it. I stopped bringing my dishes to Daniel and Priya's house. Not dramatically. Not as a statement. I had always, at every family gathering, brought something I had made. And after that Sunday, I stopped. I came empty-handed. I ate what was served. I thanked Priya for the food she made, which was always well prepared and thoughtfully presented, and which nourished the body in all the ways food is supposed to nourish it. And I kept my lamb braise and my mother's recipe book for Sunday lunches at home, where Joe and Marjorie and her family ate it appreciatively and without once suggesting that the world had left it behind. The thing about a single dismissal is that it passes. One unkind word, one careless comment, and with time and grace it can be absorbed. It becomes something that happened, rather than something that is happening. You move forward. The wound closes, more or less. But one dismissal rarely stays one. Once you have heard it, you begin to hear the shape of it in other things. The way Priya described her recipe is quite heavy when someone mentioned it. The way she talked about her own food philosophy is how people eat now. The implicit contrast being with how people used to eat, before they knew better. The way she looked at Sam's plate when he asked for seconds of whatever I had made for lunch at our house. Not critically, not with open disapproval, but with the particular expression of someone who was deciding not to say something they are thinking. Sam was Priya's son and my grandson. He was 10 years old, and he had, from the time he was old enough to have preferences, preferred my cooking to almost anything else he was offered. I want to be careful about how I say this. I am not boasting. I am not in competition with his mother. But it was simply true, and children are honest about these things in a way that adults learn not to be. He would come into my kitchen and lift lids off pots with his father's curiosity. He would say, "What are you making?" and listen to the answer with genuine interest, leaning against the counter with his arms folded in unconscious imitation of Joe, watching me work. He loved the lamb braise. He loved the slow-cooked things, the rich things, the things that took time and arrived at the table with a weight to them. He ate them with the uncomplicated appetite of a child who has not yet been taught to regard food as a moral category. Priya was not oblivious to this. I could see her noticing it, noticing that her son's enthusiasm for food seemed to peak in my kitchen in a way it did not peak in hers. And I think this troubled her. Not out of jealousy. Exactly. She is not a jealous person, but out of something more complicated. Something to do with her food philosophy being challenged by her own child's pleasure in what she had decided to call old-fashioned. She said something once to Daniel, not to me, though I was nearby and I heard it. She said, "I worry that Sam is going to develop unhealthy eating habits from spending so much time at your parents' house." She said it with the gentle reasonableness of someone who has thought about it carefully and arrived at a measured concern. Daniel said, "Mom's cooking has never hurt anyone." "Priya," she said, "I know. But the portion sizes, and the amount of fat in some of the things," Daniel said. "He's 10 and he runs around all day." "I think he's fine," she said. "I just want him to understand that there are healthier choices." The conversation moved on. I was in the hallway. I had a cup of tea in my hand and I was on my way back to the sitting room, and I had heard something I was not supposed to hear, which had the additional sting of telling me that the Sunday table comment had not been a single faultless moment. It was a settled view. My cooking was a concern. My lamb braise, my slow-cooked things, my mother's recipes. They were, in Priya's careful assessment, something she wished her son ate less of. I went back to the sitting room. I sat down. I drank my tea. Jo was telling Marjorie something about the garden. The children were in the other room. The afternoon went on, and something that had been warm in me, some particular warmth around Daniel's house, around family gatherings there, around the acts of cooking and bringing and sharing that had been the language of my family love for 30 years. Something in that warmth cooled a little. Not extinguished, but cooled. I talked to Bea about it. Bea has been my friend for 35 years. She is a small woman with large opinions and the particular gift of making you feel, when she says something, that the saying of it has clarified the world. She said, "Connie," she said, "your cooking was old-fashioned and you've been folding yourself up ever since." I said, "I haven't folded up," she said. "You stopped bringing your dishes to Sunday lunch," I said. "I didn't want to impose," she said. "You have been bringing your dishes to Sunday lunch since before Daniel could walk." "When did it become imposing?" I said. "When someone looked at them and said they were old-fashioned," she said. "One person," I said. "My son's wife." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "What does Daniel say about it?" I said. "I haven't told Daniel," she said. "Why not?" I said. "Because he chose her. And I love him. And I will not ask him to choose between the two of us over a lamb braise." She said, "It's not about the lamb." "You know that," I said. "I know," she said. "It's about 30 years of who you are being called obsolete," I said. Yes, she said. And you're just going to let that stand? I said. I don't know what else to do with it. She looked at me. In the way of 35-year friendships, with full knowledge and no illusions and complete, unwavering love. She said, something will happen. Something always happens, Connie. You just have to be ready to receive it when it does. I did not know what she meant. I found out several months later. Sam came to me on a Wednesday afternoon in March with a piece of paper in his hand and the expression of someone who has been given an assignment they are genuinely interested in. He said, Grandma Connie, I need your help. I said, sit down and tell me about it. He sat at my kitchen counter. Joe's stool, the one he always used, the high one by the window. And he explained. His class was doing a project. Heritage food, they called it. Each child was to research a dish that was significant to their family's food history. Cook it, bring it to school, and explain its background to the class. They were then going to assemble all the dishes into a kind of class feast, where everyone would taste each other's heritage foods. He said, I want to do the lamb. I looked at him. He said, your lamb, the one you make. Can we do that one? I said. What made you think of that one? He said. Because it's the best food I've ever eaten, and also because it's old. Like, it's been in the family for a long time. That's what heritage means, right? Old stuff that matters. I said. That is exactly what heritage means, he said. So can we? I said. Yes. But you should know. It takes all day. It's not a quick thing, he said. I know. I've watched you make it. He paused. I've watched you make it about 15 times, I said. And you've been paying attention, he said. I know about the herbs. I know you put the rosemary in early and the parsley at the end. I know you use red wine, but not too much. I know the carrots go in later than the other vegetables because they cook faster. I looked at my grandson, 10 years old, with Daniel's eyes and Priya's precision and something entirely his own. Some quality of attention that he had been bringing to my kitchen since he was old enough to stand at the counter. I said, You have been paying attention, he said. I always pay attention in your kitchen. We set a date. The following Saturday. Sam told his parents he was coming to mine to work on his school project, which was entirely true. And he arrived at 9 o'clock in the morning with a notebook and a pen and the particular seriousness of a child who has decided something is important and intends to do it properly. We began. I want to describe the Saturday because it was one of the best days I had had in a long time. Not because anything dramatic happened. Not because anything was said that changed the world. But because something very simple happened. A child came to my kitchen and asked to be taught. And I taught him. I began where my mother had begun with me. At the beginning. The cut of the lamb and why. Not just what to buy, but what you are looking for and why those particular qualities matter to this particular dish. He wrote it down. He asked questions. Good questions. Specific questions. The questions of someone who is genuinely trying to understand rather than simply execute. The vegetables. I showed him the root vegetables and we talked about each one. Why turnip and not just carrot and parsnip? Why the sweetness of the parsnip does something different to the sauce than the earthiness of the turnip. He tasted each one raw, which I always did with the children but which Priya had never allowed at her table. Raw vegetables were fine. Raw root vegetables less so in her philosophy. He made faces at the raw turnip and then said, "But it's different when it's cooked." "Right," I said. "Yes. Everything is different when it's cooked. And that is one of the great miracles of cooking." He wrote that down too. The herbs. I showed him my mother's way. The rosemary stripped from the stems and added early. The thyme bundled and added with the vegetables. The parsley held back until the very end when the heat had already done its work and the parsley just needed to arrive rather than cook. He smelled each herb in my hand before it went in. He said the rosemary was the strongest. I said yes. And strong things need more time to give themselves to a dish rather than simply announce themselves. He wrote that down. He drew a little diagram. The wine. I showed him the amount and I let him pour it in. Carefully. Seriously. Because pouring wine into a hot pot is not nothing and he knew it. The sizzle and the steam as it hit the pan. The way the smell changed immediately. The wine rising and the base of the sauce beginning to build. He said, "That's amazing," and I said, "Yes, it is." We cooked through the morning. We checked on the braise at intervals. We talked between checks about other things. School, his friends, something funny that had happened at football training. He told me about a book he was reading. I told him about a book I was reading. We disagreed about whether a particular film he had seen was good or not, and the disagreement was vigorous and pleasant and entirely without resolution. At lunch, we ate something simple. Sandwiches, because the lamb was still hours away. And Sam sat at my kitchen table and looked at the oven with the expression of someone waiting for something they know is going to be worth waiting for. He said, "Grandma Connie, how long has this recipe been in the family?" I said, "As far as I can trace, 4 generations. Your great-great-grandmother made it." He said, "4 generations," I said. "At least," he said. "So it's been going for like 100 years," I said. "More. Probably." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his notebook. He said, "I'm going to write about that. About how long it's been going. That's the heritage part, right? That it keeps going," I said. "That is exactly the heritage part," he said. "I'm going to say that it keeps going because every generation teaches the next one. And the teaching is part of the recipe." I looked at my grandson, at his notebook and his pen and his 10-year-old understanding of something that had taken me decades to be able to articulate. I said, "Tan. That is one of the truest things anyone has ever said in this kitchen." He looked pleased. He was too old to show it as completely as he would have at 7. But it was there. The lamb came out of the oven at 4 o'clock. We lifted the lid and the steam came up and the smell filled the kitchen, and Sam said, "There it is," with the recognition of someone who has been waiting for something they know. The way you recognize a piece of music you have not heard in a while but which has always been inside you. We tasted it. I gave him a proper taste. The lamb and the sauce and a piece of the root vegetables. And he ate it with full attention, the way he had always eaten it. He said, "How do you make it taste like that?" I said, "Time. And attention. And everything that went before it." He said, "What went before it?" I said, "Your great-grandmother's hands. And hers before her. Every time it's made. It carries all the times it's been made before. That's what makes it taste like that." He thought about this. He wrote something in his notebook. He said, "I'm going to say that at school." I said, "You should." The class feast was on a Friday. I was not there. Parents and grandparents were not invited to the feast itself. It was for the children, which was right and appropriate. But Sam came home that Friday evening, and he came directly to my house. He asked Priya to drop him off, which she did, and he sat at my kitchen counter with the particular energy of someone who has been waiting all day to report something. He said, "Grandma Connie." It was the most popular dish. I said, "Was it?" He said, "Everyone wanted seconds. Even the ones who said they didn't like lamb. Even Tyler, who says he doesn't eat meat. He had some and he said it didn't taste like what he thought meat tasted like." He paused. "I don't know exactly what that means, but I think it was a compliment." I said, "I think so too." He said, "And Mrs. Patterson. She's the teacher. She said my presentation was the most detailed in the class. She said I clearly understood not just how to make the dish, but why it mattered." He looked at his notebook, which he had brought with him. "She said the best part was what I said about the teaching being part of the recipe. She wrote it on the board." I sat very still for a moment. He said, "She wrote it on the board. Grandma Connie." Like a quote. She said it was profound. "I don't think I've been called profound before." I said. "You were," he said. "She asked me who taught me that." I said, "You did." I said, "I didn't teach you that. You figured that out yourself." He said, "You showed me enough that I could figure it out." That's the same thing, isn't it? Like the recipe, I looked at my grandson and I thought about my mother, standing beside me in the flat kitchen teaching me the dish, and about her mother teaching her, and about the unbroken line of it, and about how it had now moved forward one more generation on a Saturday in March with a boy and a notebook and a diagram of verbs. I said, "Yes, that is the same thing." He stayed for an hour. We had tea. He had graduated to very weak tea with a great deal of milk and sugar, which I considered a reasonable beginning. And he told me the details of every dish at the feast. The Jamaican rice and peas that his friend Marcus had brought. The Polish pierogi that Sophia had made with her grandmother. The very spicy Szechuan dish that William had brought and which apparently had made 3 children cry with a happiness that resembled distress. He said, All the grandmothers were involved. Almost every dish had a grandmother somewhere in it. I said. That does not surprise me, he said. Mrs. Patterson said something about that too. She said grandmothers are the keepers of food knowledge. I said. Mrs. Patterson sounds like a woman worth listening to, he said. She's pretty good. He went home. And I sat in my kitchen with my tea and I thought about the afternoon and about 30 years and about what my mother had given me and what I had given Sam. And I thought, it does not matter that Pri called it old-fashioned. It does not change what it is. What it is goes on, regardless of what it is called. Sam carries it now. He wrote it in his notebook. He said it in front of his class and his teacher put it on the board. Old-fashioned. If this is what old-fashioned contains, then old-fashioned can keep its word and I will keep my recipe. Aisha was ill in April. Nothing serious. A childhood stomach bug. The kind that takes a week and leaves a child pale and depleted at the end of it. She could not keep much down for the first few days. She lay in her bed and she refused the things Priya offered her. The carefully considered, nutritionally appropriate foods that Priya's philosophy provided for illness. The rice. The plain chicken. The things designed to be gentle. Aisha ate none of it. Daniel called me on the Wednesday, the 4th day. He said, Mom, I know this is a strange question, but do you have any of your vegetable soup? The one with the dumplings. Aisha has been asking for it. I was quiet for a moment. He said, she keeps saying she wants Grandma Connie's soup. She won't eat anything else. Priya has tried everything and Aisha just... She wants that specific soup. I said, I'll make some tonight and bring it tomorrow. He said, you don't have to bring it. I can come, and I said, I'll bring it. It should be fresh. I made the soup that evening. The same soup my mother made for sick children for decades. A rich vegetable broth, long cooked, with the dumplings that were the particular feature of it. Small and dense and made with the rendered fat that Priya would never have in her kitchen and which were, nonetheless, exactly what a sick child's body sometimes requires. Not every sick body. Not every time. But sometimes. Some illnesses call for something substantial. Something with a weight to it. Something the body can feel arriving. I brought it the next morning in the heavy pot. The old pot. The one that had been my mother's. The one Priya had once looked at in my kitchen and said it was rather battered. Wasn't it? They had excellent quality modern ones if I wanted to replace it. Priya let me in. She looked tired. 4 days of a sick child will do that, regardless of how efficiently you manage everything else. She looked at the pot and she said, Connie, thank you for coming. I said, how is she? She said, the same. She won't eat. She asks for your soup every few hours and then when I give her what I have she says it's not the same. A pause. I know it sounds, I said. It doesn't sound like anything. Sick children know what they want. She showed me up to Aisha's room. My granddaughter was in her bed, small and pale in a way of children getting over something. She was 7 years old, and she had her mother's eyes, and she looked, at that moment, like someone who needed something specific and had not been given it. She saw me and she said, "Grandma Connie." "Did you bring the soup?" I said. "I brought the soup," she said. "The real one?" "With the dumplings," I said. "The real one." She did not sit up with any great energy, but she arranged herself in a way that indicated readiness. Priya brought a bowl and I ladled the soup. Warm still from the journey, the dumplings intact, the broth exactly the color it should be. I set it on the tray on Aisha's lap. She ate. Not quickly. She had not eaten properly in 4 days and her stomach needed time. But she ate steadily. More than she had eaten in 4 days. Priya told me later. More than any of the carefully chosen foods had managed. I sat in a chair by Aisha's bed while she ate. Priya stood in the doorway, watching. When Aisha had finished most of the bowl, she said, "Grandma Connie, why does your soup taste like that?" I said. "Like what?" "My love," she said. "Like it. Like it's always been there. Like it was waiting for me." I looked at her pale face and her finished bowl. I said, "Because it has always been there. It was there when your dad was little and sick, and before him when I was little and sick, and it comes from long before either of us." She said, "It tastes like being better already," I said. "That's what it's supposed to taste like." She gave me back the bowl and she lay down, and within 20 minutes she was asleep. The real sleep, not the restless, turning sleep of illness, but the deep, settled sleep of someone whose body has received something it needed. I went downstairs. Priya was in the kitchen. She had made tea. Proper tea, I noticed. Not the herbal kind. She pushed a cup toward me and she sat down at the kitchen table and she looked at me. And for a moment she did not say anything. Then she said, "Connie," I said. "She'll be fine. She just needed something with a bit of substance to it." She said, "I know." She looked at her cup. I gave her everything that was supposed to be right for a sick child. Everything I know about what the body needs. And none of it. She stopped. I said, "It wasn't wrong. What you gave her. It was appropriate and careful. But there are some things the body wants beyond what it needs. Some things that work because of what they carry rather than what they contain." She said, "I don't usually believe in that." I said, "I know," she said. But watching her eat just now she stopped again. She looked at her hands on the cup. She said, "She ate more in 20 minutes than she had in 4 days." I said nothing. She said, "Connie, can I say something?" I said. "Please," she said. "I think I said something once. At Sunday lunch. About your cooking being old-fashioned." I was quiet. She said, "I didn't think about what I was saying. I was thinking about the food, about the fat content, about... I was thinking about it as a category of food rather than as..." She stopped. "Rather than as something that was yours. Something you had been doing for 30 years. Something that came from your mother. I looked at this woman, my son's wife, Aisha's mother. The woman who had come into my family with her clean food philosophy and her convert certainty, and who had, without meaning to, made me feel that 30 years of love in food form was obsolete. She said, I was wrong. Not about the food itself. I still think some of what I believe is right. But about the way I said it. About not thinking about what I was saying it about. I said, it was not just a dish, she said. I know that now. I think I always knew it, and I didn't let myself know it. I said, why not? She looked at her cup. She said something I did not expect. She said, because my mother was not a good cook. She was not. She was not present in the kitchen. The kitchen in our house was where the worry about food happened, not the love. And when I changed my own relationship with food, when I found my philosophy, part of what I was doing was deciding that the old way, the way with the richness and the time and the heaviness of it, was a bad way. The way that came from not knowing better. She looked up. And I think somewhere in that I decided that your cooking was part of the old way I was leaving behind. And I am sorry. Because that wasn't fair. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the April morning was mild and the garden was doing its April thing. New growth on everything. I said, Priya, your philosophy saved something for you. I understand that now, better than I did. And it is a good philosophy for what it gave you back. But it is not the only philosophy. And the food I cook her, what it carries is not what you were escaping. What it carries is different. It is the love of women who had nothing else to give but gave this. Every day. Faithfully. She said, I see that. I said, your daughter sees it too. She knew what she needed when she was sick. She said, she did. I said, that is a body's wisdom. Older than any philosophy. She said, yes, we sat for a while longer. We talked about Aisha, about how she would recover, about what to give her for the rest of the week. I told Priya what to make. Not my recipes, not the old-fashioned ones, but the right things for a recovering stomach. She listened. She asked questions. She took notes on her phone, and I answered with the same attention I gave Sam in the kitchen, because knowledge shared across the table is knowledge that matters, whatever the direction it travels. As I was leaving, she said, Honey, would you come and cook with me sometime? Not to teach me your recipes, necessarily, but just to be in the kitchen together. I looked at her. She said, Sam talks about being in your kitchen constantly. He says he learns things he can't learn anywhere else. And I think she paused. I think I've been a bit arrogant about what I know and what I don't. I said, that is a very honest thing to say, she said. It took 4 days of a sick child to get there, I said. The important things often do. I'm 67 years old and I have been cooking seriously for 58 years. I'm still cooking. I intend to keep cooking for as many years as my hands will cooperate, which I believe will be many, because my grandmother cooked until she was 89 and her hands were good until nearly the end, and I inherited her hands. I take care of them. The lamb braise is still mine. It still takes all day. It still carries my mother and her mother before her, and now it carries Sam. It's Saturday in March with his notebook and his pen and his diagram of herbs and his 10-year-old understanding that the teaching is part of the recipe. It carries all of that, and it always will. And Priya can call it old-fashioned, and I will call it exactly what it is. Though she has not called it old-fashioned again. Not since April. Not since Asia and the soup and the kitchen table conversation and the particular honesty that arrived when she was tired enough to stop managing and just speak. I have been to Priya's kitchen 3 times since then. The first time was strange. For both of us, I think. 2 women in a kitchen who have very different ideas about what a kitchen is for. Circling each other carefully, finding out what the other knows. But strange in the interesting way, the way that is different rather than uncomfortable. She showed me what she knew. I showed her what I knew. We found, as I suspected we would, more common ground than the word old-fashioned had suggested. We both cared about flavor. We both cared about feeding the people we loved with attention and intention. We both believed that what goes into a meal matters, though we had different ideas about what matters meant. The second time was easier. The third time was something close to comfortable. Asia got better, as children do, with the simple, efficient recovery of the young. She came to my house the following week still slightly pale but entirely herself, and she sat at my kitchen counter on Joe's stool and she said, "Grandma Connie, can I learn to make the soup?" I said, "You're a bit young for the dumplings. They need strong hands," she said. "My hands are strong," I said. "Show me." She showed me her hands. They were 7 years old and perfectly good hands. I said, "All right. We'll try the dumplings. And if they're a disaster, we can start over." They were not a disaster. They were better than they should have been for a first attempt, which told me that she had her father's instinct for cooking and his attention in the kitchen. She stood at my counter with flour on her arms up to the elbows, and she rolled the dumplings with a seriousness that I recognized. I had worn that same expression. My mother had worn it. Her mother had worn it. We put the dumplings in the pot and we waited for them, and when they were done we ate them at the kitchen table. The 2 of us. Joe was in the garden. And Aisha said, with her mouth full, "Mine taste the same," I said. "Almost the same." "Yours need a little more time in the water," she said. "Will you show me next time?" I said. "Every time. Until you know it without me." She nodded. She ate another dumpling. She said, "When I know it without you, I'll teach my children." I looked at my granddaughter. 7 years old. Flour on her arms. Soup on her chin. The particular seriousness of someone who has already decided something important. I said, "Yes. That is exactly how it works." Here is what I want to say to you. What I have been working toward through all of this. The food of those who came before us is not old-fashioned. I know that is a simple thing to say, and I know that the world is full of people who will say otherwise. Who will say that food should be optimized, cleaned up, modernized, made more efficient or more nutritious or more aligned with what we now understand about bodies and health. And they are not wrong. All of them. About all of it. There is real knowledge in the modern understanding of food. I do not dismiss it. But real knowledge is not a monopoly. The knowledge that lives in a recipe passed through 4 generations of women's hands is also real. The knowledge of what a sick child needs when her body is telling her something true. The knowledge that the broth and the dumplings carry not just fat and protein, but safety and love and the particular weight of being cared for. That is also real knowledge. As real as any label. As measurable. If you know how to measure it. Do not let anyone call your inheritance old-fashioned without answering them. Not loudly. Not with argument, but with the continuing act of making it, of keeping it going, of teaching it to the next pair of hands, patiently, on a Saturday morning with a notebook and a diagram of herbs. Sam has his notebook. He still has it. He brought it to my kitchen 2 weeks ago for a different dish. The chicken stew, which is another story entirely, another generation's hands in it. And he had the lamb diagram in the front, and he showed me something he had added to it. A note at the bottom, in his handwriting. Mrs. Patterson said the teaching is part of the recipe. Grandma Connie said yes. He had put my name beside it. In the notebook with the recipes and the herbs and the diagram. My name. I am in the kitchen. Joe is reading in the garden. The pot is on the stove and the smell is filling the house the way it has filled every house I have cooked in for 58 years. The smell that does not ask for permission. The smell that says, without words, in the only language that reaches all the way down to where people live. Someone loves you and wanted you to have this. My mother's recipe book is in the drawer. My grandmother's pot is on the shelf. Sam's notebook has my name in it. Call it what you like. I know what it is.